Leading our discussion and introducing our first guest is Justin Johnson. Justin serves as a senior policy analyst for defense budgeting policy in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. He has over a decade of Capitol Hill experience on defense and foreign policy issues. Immediately prior to joining us here at Heritage, he served as Deputy Chief of Staff and Military Legislative Assistant for Representative Doug Lamborn, who was a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Mr. Johnson received his master's degree from the Naval War College, and he earned his undergraduate degree from Covenant College. Please join me in welcoming Justin Johnson. Justin?
Thank you all for being here this afternoon or watching online, particularly given how nice of a November afternoon it is. So before introducing Raj, just want to mention a few things. First of all, we are trying to use a hashtag for this event in this series, just simply hashtag defense reform. So if you are social media inclined, please feel free to use that. Also, this is part of a series. This is our second event of an indeterminate number of events. The next one we've got is actually next week, November 10th. With a few individuals from Center for New American Security and Frank Hoffman from NDU, trying to expand the defense reform conversation beyond acquisition and personnel. We've got some others hopefully coming up that we'll be announcing in the next day or two. Lastly, Heritage does a lot of national security foreign policy work. If you're interested in getting regular emails from us about just all the work we do, you can either see me afterwards or we will hopefully send an email afterwards to all of you who RSVP'd and offer you a chance to subscribe if things go as they ought. So let me introduce Raj Shah. He is our keynote speaker. He'll give remarks, take some Q&A, and then we'll go into a panel with a few very interesting folks. Raj has a very, I'd say, accomplished background. He's currently Senior Director of Strategy at Palo Alto Networks. Previously was CEO and co-founder of Morta Security, which was then acquired by Palo Alto. He's served in a variety of other positions, Vice President of Federal Systems, a private investment firm. He was Special Assistant in the Office of Secretary of Defense, where he worked on technology acquisition issues, which is obviously very relevant to us today. Worked at McKinsey, served as an F-16 pilot in the U.S. Air Force, including multiple combat tours. He has his undergraduate is from Princeton and MBA from the Wharton School. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and affiliate with Stanford University's International Security Center for International and Security Cooperation. And also, particularly interesting for us today, he is still an Air Force reservist, and in that role is a member of the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, DGUS. So with that, I'll turn it over to Raj, and please help me in welcoming.
Thank you. It's great to be here with everyone today. It gives me an excuse to leave my flip-flops at home and find my ties when I come visit Washington, D.C. from California. And apologies if I seem uncomfortable wearing a tie. No. So look, much has been said about the rift between innovation in Silicon Valley and the Department of Defense. There's every day there's a different group or organization that I see visiting the West Coast and trying to really harness the culture of innovation that we've seen develop there over the last decade. And I'm privileged to be part of the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, which is Secretary Carter's organization, and as he calls it, his own startup to help bridge those divides between the Valley and the Defense Department. I wanted to start with just a little bit of historical context, right? Because you hear so much about, well, the cultures are different, these groups don't understand one another, and it's guys in flip-flops at Facebook, bringing their dogs to work versus trying to solve real problems here in the department. But I think it's valuable to look back at historics of how did the Valley actually start? Right? What was the origination of Silicon Valley? And it started by a guy named Fred Terman. So Fred Terman, during World War II, ran the electronic warfare lab. It was actually at Harvard. He had 800 scientists that were trying to solve the problem of German radar. Right, our bombers kept getting shot down by German early warning systems, and we need better ways to jam and defend that self. And so he was the founder of a crash program to help protect our bombers. Following the close of World War II, he moved to California and became the dean of the Stanford School of Engineering and continued his close relationship with the Department of Defense. In 1947, I just found the stat, half of the budget of the engineering department at Stanford was funded by the U.S. military. And they continued to build EW systems. They developed the first microwave tubes that was the foundation of radar jamming and electronic interception. That history continued, right? The Polaris missile systems were built by Lockheed there in Sunnyvale. The storied program Corona of the CIA spy satellites were built on Willow Road in Palo Alto, which we found out. So there's been a very long history and close relationship of critical national security technologies built in the Valley that the department has benefited from. Of course, in recent decades, for a whole host of reasons, that's changed. There's been an influx of private capital and venture capital. There's been cultural divides post-Vietnam between the Department of Defense and, again, innovators in the Valley. And so, this is, I think, a real issue for us. $20 billion of venture investment was put into companies last year. In one particular area, if you look at cyber, there was 450 startups that were funded. And these are all, I think, very critical technologies for the government. And so this is why I'm very, optimistic and excited about the DIUX program. It matters for us to have access not just to the big companies or the types of things that you've heard like Google and Apple, Facebook, Twitter, who have revolutionized the way we communicate and work, but all the backbone infrastructure as well, like Workday and GitHub, New Relic. These are all Valley-based companies that enable the way we do business today. So I think it really matters for the government to get access, and more importantly, at the end of the day, right, Department of Defense, these are critical to saving lives for our folks on the battlefield. There's a great group out there called BMNT. It's run by a former Army colonel named Pete Newell. And I'm going to steal one of his stories, but of why this is important. But in 2009, he ran the Rapid Equipping Force for the DoD. And at that time in Afghanistan, the threat of IEDs had really cropped up, and they didn't have MRAPs and some of the up-armored items. And the roads in Afghanistan are very different than obviously the ones in Iraq, and you couldn't use the same mine-clearing equipment. And so he had found a system where they took a Bobcat and basically put rollers on front of it that would help solve this. And to hear him express his frustration of how, in an urgent need in the office that was built to man these things, it took them 9 months to get the first prototype out there and acquired. And he said, in that 9-month period, over 50 individuals were casualties or lost their lives because of IEDs. So it matters, right? And so that's where I think DIUX comes in. So the Defense Innovation Unit X, based in Moffett Field in California, has 3 core missions. Mission 1 is strengthen existing relationships and build new ones with the venture community, with entrepreneurs, and existing companies out there. 2 is to scout for breakthrough technologies and help enable their adoption into the department. And then finally, and thirdly, is to serve as a point of presence, almost an embassy model for DoD folks coming out to visit the Valley. And that's, 1, for cultural context, but 2, more importantly, there are lots of well-meaning people in the Valley, lots of real patriots, but after their 10th meeting with someone from a 3 or 4-letter group that they all come together, it becomes frustrating. So it's to help kind of coordinate some of those things. So now if I think about or talk about a little bit of what's the hierarchy of goals that DGUS is set up to do, right? So I almost think of them, and if you think of it like as a pyramid in terms of importance versus how long it'll take to happen. The first one is a part to help support the third offset strategy. This is something that Secretary Work and Secretary Carter have both spoken about, right? First offset, nuclear weapons and the deterrence from there. Second offset, stealth technology and GPS and precision-guided munitions. And now we're in the third offset, which includes cyber and other types of technology. And so how can the Valley and the innovation system there assist in that third offset? What are interesting or key technologies we can help transition? So that's sort of the top of the pyramid. The second piece is business efficiency. My own personal opinion as a reservist, when I have to go travel somewhere and use DTS, I just want to scream, why are we using 15-year-old technology to file a travel voucher, right? In my corporate life, we have great systems that are very user-friendly, and I can use my app on my phone. So there are a whole host of business efficiency items that we could bring to bear. Warfighter necessity, of course, meeting requirements. What are some of the next-gen technologies that the Valley can support? And then finally, it's outreach and education. And I want to talk a couple of minutes on this, and then I'll give some specifics of things we're doing, then open it for Q&A. But there's so much talk about how different the cultures are, and it's true, the cultures are very different. But I think it's incumbent on the government and the Department of Defense to show value to the entrepreneurial community. Like, why should you work with the DoD? I'll give an example for myself, right? So I had the fortune of founding a company with two former engineers from Fort Meade. We'd all met there. We understood the government very well. One was an active duty military officer, and one was a career NSA guy. And we purposely, as we built the company, refused to engage with any government contracts or even have those conversations, right? Because one, we knew that the time horizon to demonstrate our capability to actually getting a contract, that life cycle, the company may not even be around or would have shifted 3 or 4 times. And secondly, there was a perception, right or wrong, in the venture community that government revenue would actually lower your valuation as an early stage startup. Right? The fear is your technology is viable only for a single customer and not across the broad spectrum of the Fortune 500, which it takes to build a company. And so I think it's incumbent on us in the defense industry to make the case to entrepreneurs of here's why you should work for the government, be it rapid access to contracts and efficient ways of securing them, be it access to test data, be it just access to smart folks that are working on this problem set. But I think it's an approach where we have to be humble and say, we're not big bad DoD arriving. We're the big elephant in the room. A lot of folks that say, well, the world has changed. I don't need that. And so this outreach and education piece, I think, is very important and will take time. Will take patience. This is not something that's going to get solved in the next month or next quarter. So finally, a little bit around the structure of DIUX. So it's got a mix of active duty personnel as well as reservists like myself that are assisting. And the reserve piece, we are, as one of our members say, of the Valley, just not in the Valley, right? Meaning you can understand and have the relationships in these communities to help bridge that and help bridge trust. So we have a charter to experiment that ranges from trying new acquisition means to non-dilutive capital. DIUX has made an investment in InQtel to help support companies, hosting events such as hackathons, pitch nights, other types of things, classified threat briefs for CISOs. So there's a whole host of things that the organization is doing and standing up. And again, so I'm very optimistic about the progress of DIUX. I think it's extremely important for the government. I think it's extremely important for the nation in general to have these two important centers working more closely. So by that, I'm sure I've exceeded my time. So I'm happy to answer any questions now or during the panel. Sir.
There's a microphone.
Oh.
If you could. Hi, Sean Lingus with FCW. You mentioned, I mean, you're a member of DIUX. Can you explain what that means day to day in terms of your work, how you balance your two hats? It's DIUX member and then Palo Alto Networks.
Sure. So there's there's obviously many reservists in California, in the Silicon Valley area, that are in different portions of technology in the investor community and technology companies. And as the unit was being formed, it was realized that this is a great opportunity for us to leverage instead of having these reservists travel across the country to drill in a function area that is unrelated to their current position. Let's use them here. So the idea for the reservists is to be that connective tissue between the community and the DoD. So for example, if we host a pitch night, help us ensure that the leading VCs in that topic area are present. Help us scout and invite the right level of companies, and just help us be culturally attuned to showing value to them. So it's a mix of introductions and counsel, and from a structural standpoint, it's stopping by the office. There's a lot of virtual work, but there is there's a strong and growing number of reservists that want to be involved with this. Really had pride in their time in the service and want to stay involved. Sir.
Thanks. Hi, Raj. My name's Steve Rubright with BAE Systems. I was just curious, in terms of working with some of the VCs and working with some of the companies in the wake of the Snowden leaks and some of the other stuff that's come out, what is that like day to day? Are you getting a lot of resistance from companies who are reluctant to either work with the government or be perceived as working with the government?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's no way to wash it out. There is a Snowden hangover, right, of fear and mistrust that really reached the pinnacle, and I think that's all the more reason why, instead of being something they read in the papers, they can actually interact with individuals to understand why do these, what is the mission sets these folks are doing. So I think more tactically, what does that mean in terms of getting over the Snowden hangover? So one is to understand and help translate for companies that are like, why do we do these things? Like, why is drone technology important to the military, right? Yes, there's weapons effects and importance for that, but there's other things as well that surveillance can help save lives in humanitarian disasters. So having those conversations, there's no easy way around it. I think it's just going to take time to rebuild that trust.
Hi, Bill Broderick from Analytical Graphics. I was wondering, is there any conversation with your group and also at the building on other factions in DCMA, DPAP, and others about the commercial item acquisition front? Really the erosion of that over 10 years, because many of us just remain skeptical that if you have one faction of the department issuing proposed rules to continue to erode that, then you're trying to seek out innovations, rightfully so, in the Valley and elsewhere. It's not just the
Sure.
Valley. Is there that conversation? Because a lot in the community look at it as just a contradiction.
Yeah, that's a great point. The Department of Defense is not a single entity, right? There's many factions within, and they often do seem contradictory. I think from our viewpoint and our charter, I remember there was some stat I remember of that. In the last 30 years, there's been 90 defense acquisition reform blue ribbon panels that have been completed. So I think it's for us to be humble and say that it's unlikely that we're going to absolutely transform the acquisition process. That's not our mandate, nor possible. But I think in certain areas, in certain key focus groups, we can make a difference. So I guess I don't have a good answer for how do you deal with what may be seemingly polarized views, but we know we have a certain set of requirements that are very important. and we have a source of technical talent. You're right, it's not just the Valley, and I think there's goals to have this replicate, but we have a source of technical talent that the government does not normally access. So how do we do that, right? We're not talking building bridges to Microsoft. It's smaller, more agile companies. Please.
How are you? Thanks again for doing this. Josh Ivey with Podesta Group. You actually hit on something that was going to lead into my question kind of very nicely, is with the 30 years of defense acquisition reform, et cetera, what's the role of Congress, who oftentimes can play a detrimental role in getting acquisition and kind of breakthrough technologies into the building? On the other hand, they sometimes play a very helpful role in getting these cutting edge technologies in. What do you see the role of Congress with your group and bridging that gap as well between the Valley and DC?
I think that's a great point. I think we're very early in that phase, right? So to give it perspective, it just was officially stood up about 2 months ago. We're still figuring out just the machinery of how do you assign billets, how do you get a reservist that was someone else and now in this new organization. So it's not to say we're not thinking about those, but I think to have a really cogent opinion on what other changes legislatively may be helpful, I think it'll take us a little bit of time to understand what are the roadblocks, right? Let's sit with these entrepreneurs. Why won't you apply for this SBIR? Why won't you apply for this particular contract? And I think ideas will percolate.
If no one else has a question, I have a kind of a mundane one on SCIFs and classification. Because of the intersection of Intel and how are you handling that? Do you have a GIX or just SIPR or NIPR?
So clearly some of the work that will be done will require classified access. So the unit right now is housed in a large government facility. There's a building right across the street from Offutt. Literally across from the wind tunnel. So if you look out the windows, you can see that and the hangar with no skins on it. But there are plans to have access to that type of classification as required.
Any other questions? If not, please join me in
Great.
thanking Raj.
Thank you, everyone.
If I could ask the panelists to join me here, and then I'll introduce them. Well, thank you again for being here. Let me introduce the panelists, and then we'll get into discussing some of what Roger just spoke about, and who knows what else. So let me introduce down the panel here. As usual, one of the joys of my job is getting to talk with people who are smarter than I am, and that is once again the case here with this panel. To my immediate left is Steven Rodriguez. He is the managing partner of, I messed up the pronunciation on this last time.
You can call it whatever you want.
All right. Colden?
There you go.
All right. Colden Strategic Advisors, and has 13 years of operational experience ranging from Afghanistan to Colombia. Core market experience in the aerospace and defense industry in the realm of technology assessment, game theory applications, implementing strategic initiatives for growth stage venture-backed investments. Serves on 3 corporate boards, is a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations, is a New York Fellow at the National Review Institute, is the chairman of the Foreign Policy Initiatives Leadership Council and a member of the Leadership Council at IAVA. Next to him is Jeff Orzem. Am I getting it your last name?
Just right.
Great. I'm not good with these names, obviously. Is the CEO and founder of the Eastern Foundry, an incubator for government contractors just across the Potomac in Crystal City. Jeff is a former Marine Infantry platoon commander, served in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Following the Marines, he attended Harvard Law School, after which he returned to Iraq as a tribal affairs officer with the Iraqi Transportation Network. Following this, he began working at McKinsey and Company here in the DC office, and between each job, he's backpacked in different regions of the world for 3 to 6 months to pick up some local color. Very interesting. Next to him, Yaniv Suisa.
You got Jeff, you can't get Yaniv.
Yaniv, I'm striking out here, is the founder of Sinewave Ventures, a new venture capital fund focused on connecting the top technology companies with the top VC firms to access the public sector. Before starting Sinewave, Yaniv was an investor in the NEA, New Enterprise Associates DC office, focused on early-stage tech investments, including enterprise and cloud solutions. He also worked on NEA's energy portfolio on both supply and demand side solutions across renewable technologies. Before NEA, Yaniv was a senior investment officer in the government, or was engaged in underwriting billions of dollars of debt for issuance to new innovative technology companies. He serves on a number of advisory boards, including the Technology Advisory Board for NJIT and New Jersey Economic Development Authority, recipient of a series of fellowships, including the Kauffman Fellowship, Presidential Management Fellowship, and the Hyman Kennedy and Cravath Fellowships. He earned an MBA with distinction from Oxford, Sade School of Business, Christchurch, a JD from Harvard Law, and a master's degree from the Sydney Law School. Graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Yale. Received his BA in Ethics, Politics, Economics, and Sociology. So once again, like I said, I get to talk with people who are far smarter and more accomplished than I am. So to get this discussion going, thought I'd turn to Steve first, and maybe just ask the question that I probably should have introduced or started this whole panel with, which is, why does defense reform matter, and how does that connect to venture capital and anything else you want to tack into that?
Sure. Well, sorry. I'll set these guys up as best I can. I think defense reform matters simply because we depend as a community within DoD on our qualitative technological edge, right? Like, we're not offering the most tanks or the most fighters or even the most dudes or dudettes in combat. We're offering better, faster, cheaper, which means smaller numbers of everything. And in this budget environment, the short-term planning horizon has meant that we're operating with older technology on a short-term planning horizon, which makes our future acquisition dynamic next to impossible. Now, how does that tie in with venture capital? Well, I've gotten asked this question a lot, mainly from startups, saying, can you please help me get venture capital? And then if I do get venture capital, what should I do with it, or how should I negotiate? And my response is, look, a VC is really going to offer you one of 3 or 4 things. They're going to act as a strategic financial partner, so they're going to invest in your current investment round and then hopefully stay with you and invest in future investment rounds. They're going to act as a source of business development and marketing, right? That's how companies grow, by getting sales, in theory. Although Raj probably knows who I'm talking about, someone in the VC world finally, I think, actually I know who it is, I won't say his name, but he said that revenue is a distraction. So for most of us, sales is important. So they can act as a BD driver. And then they also act as a key support function for the reason most startup companies that I've seen fail, and that's actually recruiting good talent. Most startups fail not because they didn't get investment capital or because they didn't get sales, but because they couldn't get the right people for the right job. So I think that's illuminating, given the current, I guess, fast company BuzzFeed dynamic that we're in, where it's all about, what sexy amount of capital did you get from what VC. Really, it's a key function of talent management. And then lastly, the fourth one is they act as a strategic advisor, right? So they're not only putting their money where their mouth is, but they're giving you insight, saying, hey, I own 5 other companies kind of like you. I know the market because I'm putting my money where my mouth is, and here's how I see the winds of change going. And of course, they're not just commenting for commenting's sake, but they have a powerful incentive to be honest with you, because they want you to succeed. And I think that's a good starting point from a defense reform perspective in terms of how it meets with venture capital.
Great, thank you. To either the other two of you, it's very hot, Mike. There's a lot of disconnect, I think, and Raj alluded to it, between kind of the policy development process here in Washington the budget process here in Washington, how that turns into programs in the Pentagon, and then what actually happens where innovative technology is coming from in this country, largely from Silicon Valley. Can you talk, just either one of you or both of you perhaps, about some of the challenges that you've seen in that space, and then, you know, whether it's specifically commenting on DIUX or other efforts, what are some of the good things that you may have seen or may not have seen that you would like to see?
You actually spend time in government.
Sure. So startups want absolutely nothing to do with the government, and the government has a problem understanding startups. So it's a pretty big disconnect, in my opinion. So we call it a translation function, is what we kind of do with our startups. So one of the things that Stephen missed is one of the top things that VCs do, although his list was quite comprehensive, is we de-risk financing, which is very difficult, which is one of the most important things for a startup, and is very difficult to do if you have any relationship to the public sector, because VCs want absolutely nothing to do with the public sector. They'll pretend they do. They'll take nice meetings with Obama, but they have absolutely no interest in it. The public sector is a third of spending. Private sector is 2/3. They get the private sector. It's easy. It's straightforward. It's faster. Why bother? So our fund, we actually co-invest only with the top VCs in commercial companies only, so that they're commercial companies that could also access the public sector but can still grow and proceed as if they were normal Silicon Valley companies. And so it allows them, if you give them the correct map, they're willing, and you help them, and you handhold them, they're absolutely thrilled to take public sector money. And the good news from that perspective is a lot of the technology can really impact the public sector in a meaningful way, because the Valley moves a lot faster than some of the innovation coming from other places. And they like that fact. So a lot of the entrepreneurs nowadays want to have a positive impact on the government. It's almost like a moral obligation on their part, which is an interesting phenomenon, but I think is really true. On the public sector side of things, they know they can't keep up anymore. And they know that public and private are overlapping more and more and more and more. So just think of things like Bitcoin, which everyone thinks is this private amorphous entity that will ultimately be regulated by every major political and government entity in the world, and will be a big brouhaha and mess, and will eventually figure itself out. But a good example of how public and private just continue to overlap in ways that people don't necessarily realize. But on the government side, you have some misaligned incentives, right? So you have the traditional procurement process, which is the giant SIs, and the fact that every major government employee goes to work there after they leave the government to make a ton of money to have more resources for themselves. So you have that, kind of revolving door. But at the caveat is you do have certain groups within the government that absolutely want to and know they need to engage with startups. And simultaneously, the startups don't need to compete with the SIs. So that's, I think, a big misconception. When I help my companies, we're not going after multi-billion-dollar deals. A $10 million check for one of my startups is massive, right? And the government doesn't even blink when something like that happens. So there are ways to really get them engaged and help them pervade. And I think, whether you like the company or not, or think it's relevant or not, Palantir was probably the first of the startups to actually show Silicon Valley how you could pervade the government and build a multi-billion-dollar company there. It's the only one so far, but it did give the government a taste of what it's like to work with a startup that listens to their needs, doesn't always just say, okay, you want that change, we're going to charge you another $1 billion. So they kind of are ready, I think. Long-winded answer, but covered a lot.
I'd like to just add some not caveat at all, it's just a little bit of color. I have the advantage of going to work every day helping 54 small, predominantly government contractors navigate this system. So I get to see and spend a lot of time with the companies that we're talking about who actually have started with the opening thesis that they are going to predominantly sell to the government. And a lot of the time I sit back and wonder, why did you choose this? Because if you get your charge code wrong, this isn't civil liability. You could go to jail. Like, this is criminal liability if you get this process wrong. You're going to work with a customer who's going to take you potentially years and years to get you on contract. Is going to pay you. It's going to take 4 months to pay you in a highly cash flow dependent environment. And by the way, if you tailor your product to meet their requirements, you're foregoing a tremendous opportunity on the outside. So I think that with that, I think that you have to ask, why is it that a small business should go through this torturous path? Fortunately, I think there's some really good answers. I think one of the best answers is that once you get a government contract, there's no more stable cash flow from any customer anywhere, period, in my opinion. Second reason is that especially if you're willing to start off as a services play and you don't want to immediately jump into a product offering, it's an incredibly low capital business to start up. So you can start generating meaningful cash flows, meaningful profits to fund the development of a product with probably, everyone here probably has enough money in their wallet right now to get a government contracting business started. That's not an exaggeration. So this is a tremendously fertile ground for a small business, to say nothing of all the amazing programs out there, like the SIBR program. The U.S. government is the only VC I know of that doesn't want equity. They're willing to write you significant checks and not take anything in exchange. So I think that there are some significant barriers you have to address, but once you overcome them and once you start illuminating some of the really unique benefits of working with the government, it's a tremendous, tremendous market.
Well, perhaps we can pull the string a little bit further. What are some of those kind of structural impediments? What are the actual hurdles you're trying to get over, particularly for these small and medium-sized companies? And perhaps in parallel on the VC side, I mean, if you're a VC, are you telling your companies don't even think about doing government business? What are some of the, if you're the guy actually running one of these startups, you've got kind of the sales side potentially to the government. What are the impediments there? But also, what are the potential impediments from your owners, your investors? Any of the three of you, thoughts on that?
I think the biggest challenge I've seen from the VCs I've advised and the current VC that I'm with is that once you get your investment capital, the clock starts, right? You're burning down your cash flow, because most of these companies, especially in their earlier stage, are pre-revenue, right? They're not pulling in cash. The cash you give them, assuming they're post MVP, is designed to get sales, and hopefully get that sales number going, get that sales curve going this way fast enough to where it crosses some horizontal line before the spend curve gets there first. So it's really a race against time, and unfortunately, two VCs that I've worked with specifically, they actually push their companies to fail. Not that they're interested in generating poor returns, but they say, look, it's okay if you fail, just get on with it, and no hard feelings. Like, well, if we like you enough, we'll try to fund you again. But we just want to know and know quickly. That doesn't really work, in a federal sales cycle where a DARPA Phase 2, SBIR award time frame is roughly equivalent with Moore's Law. So in a brief, anecdote answer, you're running through a triad of risk, speed, and money, and hoping that equation nets out to a date on the calendar when you start becoming cash flow positive on your own. And if you're not, then you're out of money. And we've seen some companies recently, like the well-known site GigaOM on the publishing side, was in all of the big magazines and was well known as a news site. Another, sadly, an example of a company I was a big fan of, Quirky. A lot of you guys probably have some of their products. Blew up or imploded spectacularly for these two simple reasons. So I think those are two immediate reasons where you're running in kind of opposite directions from a venture perspective and from a DoD perspective. So then what does that tell you? Well, from a DoD perspective, then you have to create bureaucratic and contractual mechanisms that shorten that, at least shorten the decision cycle, so they know, okay, I understand we got outclassed or outbid by another government contractor, so we'll just get on with it and focus on things that are in the near term. I don't think they mind doing business with the government. I think they mind the dynamic that the government operates within. But the mission itself, I mean, that's something that Pete Newell talks a lot about. The mission itself is very, very attractive. It's just the people and organizations that surround the mission that make it problematic.
So I guess if I were to think about with the principal barrier to entry that I see, it's informational. And I think this is an easy. There's an easy explanation. Whenever everyone thinks about selling to the Department of Defense, they immediately think of selling a better cybersecurity platform, or they think about selling a new widget that's going to go on a tank. But if you look at what DoD is spending money on, they're running one of the biggest healthcare systems on Earth. They're also running one of the biggest financing and accounting systems on Earth out of Kansas City. Those are ripe opportunities. Those should be just about carbon copy requirement sets that a GE, that a General Motors has. So I think this is part of what I'm saying about informational is we need to get better. We, DoD, and the people that want to see DoD do better, we need to be better about articulating this vast array of just basic business function-based technology that there's a real demand for. I mean, there's no reason that there shouldn't be these small businesses reading requirement statements that DoD is producing, and where they had thought about selling a electronic medical record platform to Kaiser, that they're now saying, hey, how do I sell this to DoD? I think that the department needs to get much better about understanding how to package what they need in a way that's digestible. If we send a RFP that clocks in at 150 pages, you're in the Valley more than I am, but my strong intuition is that no one's going to read it. They're just going to look at it, print it out, 2 inches thick on their desk, pass. Because I can make a sale to Google in 2 days. It's just a non-starter. But if they took the time to actually read the requirements, they'd say, you know what, I can do this. And so I think that from an informational perspective, the department could do well just by learning how to articulate requirements in a way that's going to be exciting and attractive to these small businesses.
So I agree with what you just said, but disagree with a lot of what was said. So I think that if there's a big business to be made, this is one of your earlier points, in building a business for the government, that is not a venture capital business, period. Well, I'm sure there's disagreement on the panel, but it's not a venture capital business. A VC won't fund it with a 10-foot pole. They want nothing to do with companies focused on the government. They hate services. VCs hate service companies. They want products, technology, software companies. And that's huge financing risk. Even my counterexample, which is actually the only counterexample to my thesis in the fund that's been successful, is Palantir. And there's not a single VC who funded Palantir. You can argue Peter, who put a lot of personal money in because he was one of the founders, but that's it. There's not a single VC fund that funded Palantir, even to this day. So it is a hugely risky thing and also VCs don't want you distracted. So if we're building for the public sector, and this is where I agree with George, with Jeff, it's that last point, right? It's we've already built something for the commercial sector. It happens to also apply perfectly to the public sector. It is easy for you to buy it because you understand you need it and it applies perfectly to you. Let's make that connection, right? But one of the mistakes, and I think it's something that you heard Raj talk about for what DIUX could do, and also that I'm always kind of pitching, is the government needs to be VCs and startups in the VC startup world, they only want to deal with you if you're a customer, period. And you need to figure out how to be a customer in a way that's somewhat similar to a commercial customer. Now, there are obviously different security requirements and other things like that, but you have to have the same kind of process or approach. And saying, oh, we're interested and we're showing this without business units that have budget actually having the desire to buy this and understanding of why they need it, we don't want them distracted. Like, I invest in startups to help them access the public sector, and I regularly say, don't waste your time here. Yes, it's a perfect fit, but they have no interest. They don't get it. This process isn't going to work. It's going to take you 10 years. Go here instead, right? Which is also sometimes another public sector entity. It just depends, right? So I think it's a very hard sell unless people start to unless the public sector starts to understand that they are a giant customer. They are like the Fortune 500 times 10 in multiple entities, but the government is Fortune 1000 in itself, right? And so they need to figure out how to be a customer more effectively. And I think there are new mechanisms coming out. I think DIUX is experimenting with some of those, as are others. But some of the traditional ones, so I think EQTEL is a great organization. We work with them often, but no one cares. If the startups don't need your investment money. They also don't want to give you consulting fees if you're a consulting firm. There's no interest in any of that. They want customers. And if you can be their customer, they're willing to not only engage with you and show you their new tech and work with you to an extent on the services side in adapting their tech to what you do, but they're also going to be responsive, which is the key difference between them and some of the SIs. So That's the Palantir example, right? So the government loved, at least at the beginning, you can argue now where it is, I don't know enough, but in the beginning they loved Palantir. Why? Because they said, build this for us. Palantir built it. They said, oh, but it doesn't work here, here, and here. And a typical SI would say, oh, well, you want to edit the contract? Well, that's going to be another 10 million here and 10 million there. And Palantir said, no, we'll just fix it because we want it to work for you, right? And we want it to build something here. And so Palantir moved through the government like wildfire, right? And so I think that kind of relationship is something that the government will really love and likes when they see it, but they just need to be able to, they just need to be empowered to be the customer, which I think is hard for them.
All right, let me ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to general questions. So we heard from Raj some of the work from DIUX. Here in Washington, there's a lot of interest in innovation, acquisition reform. You see Secretary Carter making trips to the Valley. If you were going to make a handful of key recommendations, either to DIUX, to senior Pentagon leaders, to Congress on acquisition reform, what would those top things, whether it's specific changes or things to keep their eyes on, things to put money behind, if you're king for a day, what are the changes you would make? Let's go down the panel.
Why don't I start on a positive note, since I seem to be the contrarian. So I've been talking with the Defense Department and the DIUX folks in various ways. I think something really interesting, and it's just an idea that came up in discussion, is so at a lot of VC firms, we have something called an experiment fund, where you can take, so NEA is a giant fund. We have, and when I was at NEA, we had 2.8 billion. Now they have over $3 billion. So $1 million is nothing, right? So if you want to put $1 million or $500,000 or even 100K into whatever deal you want, as long as one senior partner at the firm thinks it's a good idea, you're free to do it. It's an experiment, have fun, the money could go down the drain, it could be great. Sometimes it's for a relationship, sometimes it's because the tech is interesting, sometimes because you're a former entrepreneur that we trust and believe could figure something out, and it's totally fair. So instead of putting 10, 20 million into an investment vehicle that the startups don't actually care about, at least the commercial VC startups don't actually care about, what I would do is find specific business in the units in the government that can use new technology, could actually experiment with it, and give them budget. Say, look, anyone who's this overarching mission, anyone who's serving this overarching mission can apply to us, and we'll give them 50K to be a customer of whatever technology they want that fits that mission. Have fun. You're giving them extra budget, you're letting them play with the tech, and then I think eventually from there, because you'll have a huge constituency of folks in the public sector that are happy with the tech and showing its impact and showing its performance or performance increase or cost reduction, you'll have a pretty salient argument for figuring out contracting vehicles that allow them to expand the use of these new technology within the government. And I think it's an easy sell, because if you give people the opportunity to play with things and buy more things, they're going to. And the startups will love it. So that would be my recommendation, and I think it's very feasible. And hopefully we'll get done.
So I absolutely agree with everything Yaniv just said. I would say if I were king for a day, I would ask the contracting officer community to become far more aggressive and far more proactive in how they approach individual contracts. I think that most of the suggestions that DIUX, that Yaniv just suggested, already exist through OTAs, through challenges, through SIBRs. There are a multitude. People have acknowledged that the procurement system has been broken since the 50s, when Eisenhower first put OTAs out there. There's so many good tools at the disposal of contracting officers, that are at the disposal of program officers, that are at the disposal of administrators. But, and there are I think there are a lot of people that have theories about why this is. The current generation of contracting officers seem to have been brought up in a very risk-averse mindset. And again, this isn't a criticism. I think this is just a culture that's permeated the contracting community. So as a result, that puts a lot of sand into the gears of procurements. I think that if we could just get more education on the tools that are available and give people a more forward-leaning mindset at the contracting officer level, you see a lot of these problems go away.
I agree with that.
So I guess in theory, if I were advising anyone on the subject, I'd have three brief recommendations. I think number one, and this is more directed towards the strategics or the primes is, you know, a lot of primes have established venture initiatives. I mean, that's no secret, and some of them have been around for quite some time. The problem is that they're not really oriented around a, we'll call it the TRL, Technology Readiness Level Cycle, right? TRL 1 through 9. They're set up for, I guess, early to mid-stage TRL development, which is a problem, as I shared with some of you, in the current budget cycle where we're on a short-term planning horizon of 3 years or less. So how do you develop home run, you know, kind of big idea plays, much like we did in the first and second offset strategy, when you're in a near-term kind of sell environment with whatever you have? In fact, I've talked to several CTOs of, we'll call them mid-sized defense corporations, and they've been beside themselves because they're getting hammered by their leadership to sell, right? I get it. But their response is, well, what do you want me to sell? And the answer is, I don't care, just sell. Okay, fair enough, but you know, to me that sounds like a pretty, number one, a pretty crappy job. So I would, my response would be, I would layer in the commercial sector early in the TRL cycle where its place is, right? No one's suggesting, as Wes Bush said, that Google or, you know, Nest or anyone else is going to build, you know, Lursby, right? No one, you know, but I think where they can be useful in is that early stage, much like the German economy has a good example of this in the Mittelstand, where they have a saying which I don't even know if I could pronounce, but basically goes like this. They say, we make the thing that goes in the thing that goes in the thing, a subcomponent level production. And then two other quick things. One, I think GE offers a useful multinational model for how you would integrate, I guess we'll call it business unit autonomy with strong central planning. That's an example where they farmed out most of the actual thinking and doing into their respective business units. So GE Turbines is an example, and yet the central planning function, especially at a business service level, resides within GE headquarters. Sound familiar? Like that's, you know, I think that's a useful analog that DoD can take away. Because again, startups work, and there's lots of good examples within, you know, that can be applied to DoD. But you know, in fairness to DoD, you also have to offer examples that actually scale with the enterprise, right? So Facebook's early model at Harvard may or may not apply to, you know, the ARCIC at TRADOC or the Joint Staff. So that's another example. And then lastly, flexible acquisition authorities, you know, PI, partnership intermediary agreements, and OT authorities have been around for quite some time. They've generally been mismanaged though because they're focused on prototype production level contracts. So they're not interested in LRIP, and they're certainly not interested in production line contracts. They're interested in prototyping. So I would argue for, I guess, structures that allow that prototyping to enter the market, enter the ecosystem early, hopefully fail quickly, right? That's my model, at least personally. So fail quickly, and then prototype, right? Much like Yaniv was saying, I think a lot of companies would consider the federal space if, number one, they knew their tech would have immediate applicability back out into the commercial space, and I would argue that's why In-Q-Tel has been more successful. I would also argue that's why General Catalyst recently made an investment in OG Systems out in Herndon, because I think they're seeing that cross-pollination as a model that works. So I would focus on that, and then drive the investment into the production, right? Production with many of you from, you know, the primes that are in the room, drive those production contracts through you guys. So in many ways, it's gravy for you because you get, you know, vetted technology that then rolls into your production cycle already. We're just not turning to you guys to, like, you know, create the wheel from scratch.
It's also worth keeping in mind that, you know, even in my comments in particular, specifically like commercial VC focus, there's a lot of other ways to get innovation in the public sector that's not just this route, right? So you've got the work with the universities, you've got things like DARPA where you actually are giving people money to develop things specifically for the, I mean, you see all different kinds of models, right? You see the commercial and the others. So I think there's lots of ways to do it. And so things like DIUX aren't just focused on what I do, they're focused on lots of different verticals. And I think it's a great time So I've never seen more of my VC colleagues trying to figure it out. There's only a few of them, but they are trying to figure it. Like they come to me in Washington more than I visit them in the Valley now, which is very rare, right? So you see people coming through town and being interested, and so it is a good opportunity. But the key message I would say is, VCs, once they're scarred, they never get over it. So if they're actually paying attention now and actually trying to make an effort, especially the new generation of VCs, because I do think the industry has turned over quite a bit. We're kind of in a new most of the firms are all new, kind of the young up-and-coming partners. If we mess it up, they're not going to be back for a while. But I think we have a great opportunity to do some great stuff.
Great. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions from the audience. Aaron has a microphone back there, so please just wait for that to go front here.
Thanks. Yaniv, in your example, the one thing you would do to shake things up is experiment more with money in various government agencies. 2 questions. How is that not what DARPA does right now? And second, how is that politically palatable? I agree it's a good idea. How is it politically palatable to say asking Congress for funding to experiment with different things like that?
So I'll take the second one first, and then the first part of your question afterwards. So it's mission driven, right? So you'd have a specific mission for what you're trying to accomplish. You'd have the 4 or 5 I call them business units, but groups and any particular government agency with a particular mission. And it's tech specifically tailored to that mission that they're able then to experiment with and use. And then they have to prove that it increases performance or lowers cost if they're going to continue to use it, right? Or move it into an acquisition vehicle or something. The problem with a lot of the government tech guys is they're afraid. There's a big fear. It's like, oh, we're doing this, we're going to either fail or we're going to prove that we're not useful or those kind of things. But if you're giving them money to experiment, that's supposed to be lost. It's supposed to be experiment, right? Try, figure it out, try to accomplish this mission and use some extra tools. I think it would be quite salient. The other thing I'd say is on DARPA is very different. So what DARPA does is they're a real kind of a funding for development purposes. So when you get money from DARPA, you're building something specific to DARPA's needs and focus. It's not just taking a commercial technology and then buying it to deploy, right? And also, for that matter, DARPA's not a customer, really. Obviously, they're a foray to a customer, but they're not a customer. So I think DARPA's a little bit out, but I do think that the experimental approach is tenable. And it's not a lot of money. I mean, with the $10 million that the government is putting into investing in startups, right? Or they put more than that, right? If you InQtel and a few other entities. But if it, even $10 million at $50K a pop for an early stage startup, that's a big customer, right? You can have like 100 or so. You can have tons of companies, right? Tons of different technology that you're playing with. It'll totally revolutionize the public sector's relationship with the Valley.
I think one quick two-finger, I think the challenge with DARPA and defense R&D agencies writ large is the transition rate. This echoes the earlier conversations we've had, which is that it's inappropriate to say that DoD is not good at technology. DoD is actually quite good at technology. The problem is the transition rate. Mm-hmm. Like Google has set up an HR shop outside of DARPA. Like, it's not because of the technology, it's because of the dudes and dudettes making the technology that then they say, hey, look, you're running a pointless mission here. No one's going to buy the stuff that you're making anyway. Why don't you come on, with the winning team, and we'll give you a chance to realize your investment opportunities. DARPA's transition rate is one example, is 2%. Now, does that mean DARPA is bad? No, it just means that the services that buy stuff at scale are not buying the stuff that our R&D houses are making. And by that, it means it's not making it in the program of record, or it's not being pumped. So then the question, and that's actually what happened to Pete's organization of the REF. The REF got subsumed under the Arctic at TRADEI. Well, why did that happen? They had a lot of successes. Well, the reason why is because they became a good idea shelf, where all the great stuff that they were prototyping producing ended up on the shelf behind them rather than out in the field, because no one was buying it. So then it got subsumed, and now it's a good idea factory for General Perkins down at TRADEI. I mean, it's kind of sad, but it's not because Pete Newell and his guys didn't do a good job. They're crushing it out in the Valley now. So who's the lowest common denominator?
I would add one point. It's just, I think that the government's proven that they're very willing to take risks on long-range R&D. I mean, the government puts out, especially Health and Human Services, puts out billions of dollars a year through extracurricular R&D funds to universities, to large corporations, to small businesses. I hate to sound like a broken record, but the SIBR program represents, I think this year it'll be about $2.7 billion in small grants to businesses, which have a similar transition rate, around 2% will commercialize. That represents, if you want to look at it that way, a 98% failure rate, and yet Congress reauthorizes it every year. So I think the appetite is there.
Thanks. Sam Zega, Airbus. A question for you guys, or maybe even just a comment too, and this is something I've been wrestling with for a while on this discussion, but you know, there's a number of us in this room that have thought about it. Clearly you guys have thought about it, and there's a lot of great ideas, but maybe to elaborate on a point you made, Jeff, is I don't see a lot of contracting officers or government program managers sitting in this room. So the question is, how do we get these discussions out there so it's not just folks like us talking about them or the Frank Kendall type guys talking about them, but the people actually doing the real work at the end of the day where we can make a difference?
So I think that's the challenge. So I'm going to give Raj a challenge. I think that's the DIUX challenge. I think DIUX will fall flat on its face if it doesn't get the day-to-day people and the business units actually doing the things, actually building things, actually buying things, actually deploying things, actively involved in the outreach to innovation. If it's just the high levels who say innovation sounds great, great rhetoric, looks good, we know it's a good idea, but you can't get it down the pole to the units that are actually making decisions, it'll be, and that's the mistake the Valley makes, by the way. They think, you know, the secretary and the Obama are the route to get their technology, their $10 million grant awarded, which is not at all. It's, you know, Jane Smith in Reston, who's never been to Silicon Valley, who controls billions of dollars, right, and works 9 to 5 and has never seen the light of day, right? And so that's the real person who matters. So unless you can get down to those business units and get real support and real engagement at that real customer level, it'll just be a rhetorical tool. Everybody will realize it's that, and it'll frustrate people because they were distracted by spending time on it thinking you were a customer. So I think you're absolutely right.
So just to address the point, I think you're seeing a really interesting tension. I don't want to put all of this on DIUX. I think at this point, every agency has set up an innovation team. You've got the HHS Ideas Lab, you've got the USAID Development Lab, VA Center of Innovation. Everyone's trying to do this. And I think everyone's trying to figure out how to crack the same nut. And to Yaniv's point, they're all running up against the same tension. You've got these well-intentioned people who are coming out of a West Coast tradition, being said, hey, come be a presidential innovation fellow for a year, and boy, are you going to be able to make change, do your service to the nation, and people love it. And they come in and they go start these great and well-intentioned programs and run headfirst into the wall of traditional FAR-based contracting as soon as they want to implement or take their idea to scale. Recent positive example, I would say, in kind of the reason we should be optimistic is I think that GSA has actually had done some really cool stuff through their 18F program. If you look at the way that the Agile BPA was recently administered, I think that everyone, if you haven't looked into this is a reason to be hopeful about the future of government acquisitions, because it's shown that the biggest buyer for the federal government took a really innovative new approach to actually procuring something that looks a lot more like what you might see in the Valley. So there's some hope there. But there is this tension, and so kind of to your point, how do you educate? I'd love to see, right now they run acquisition universities across the government. DoD's got the biggest one. I think that should be the center of knowledge and excellence, teaching people how to do it. And you may also require pulling people out of the systems integrators. Through the mid-2000s, all the senior contracting officers were getting pulled out of agencies to go staff into systems integrators because there was so much money coming out. So the federal government lost its senior band of veteran knowledge, the people who knew the system well enough to take chances to lean forward. We may need to pull those people back into the government, recapture that knowledge, or at least have them come back to educate this generation that's currently in the seats.
And on that, I think we keep talking about DIX, one, because Raj was here, but two, because I think we're the most hopeful about them, to be honest. It's not actually a critique. I actually think they have the best opportunity, and they've started out on a great foot. And I think if they continue with some additional advice and focus, they're more likely to get there. Plus, if you do know the FAR, they always have the national security excuse, which makes it much easier to get technology into the government. So, so it's I think they're a great platform to hopefully make it work.
So directed to Yaniv, but anybody else as well, connecting a few points. VC skepticism about government, valuation and the Square IPO, and the human need for chastening. So if the upcoming Square IPO pops the valuation bubble of the unicorns in Silicon Valley, will that automatically lead to a readjustment of expectations in the VC community, thereby helping Raj and others? So should we actually hope for a...
I should have you help me raise money for my fund.
Let's
So
stop
one of the things I would say is the government, it's not really, because we're talking about, again, about $10 million checks, not billion-dollar checks when you're dealing with startups, but it is somewhat countercyclical, because when the economy goes down or the bubble deflates or the tech companies get scared, the government actually tends to spend more money. And it's also a resource that the VCs finally realize, oh, we haven't tapped this other third of the economy when this 2/3 of the economy start to slow. So for me, it's a great thing. But I do think that the VCs pay more attention when those things happen. And the bubble deflation has already started. You've seen articles about it, but if you're in the VC world, I mean, we obviously see it first, right? It's already started.
So you think the Square IPO will be a precursor?
I don't think of it about, so the IPO, I don't pretend to know much about the public markets. I do private stuff, but I will say that the valuations in our industry have started to, there's tension there. Like you see companies having to do flat rounds, having to put great companies because they're way ahead of their skis.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone knows it.
Back.
Technology flowing from the government to the private sector has had some major impact, like the internet, GPS, things like that. Do you see anything coming from the commercial sector into the government area that will have a needle-moving impact as opposed to just making, tangential impact on small things?
Well, I think we do. I mean, I guess you could argue Palantir was kind of an example, but Palantir, despite its citations, succeeded despite the government rather than because of it. The other example would be on, I'm most hopeful actually on space tech. In fact, In-Q-Tel has stood up a series of labs following Lab 41, one of which is called like Cosmic Labs or something like that. And they're really narrowing in on the major nut that has limited our access to space since Apollo was the cost per launch, right? $10,000 per pound. That instantly prices you out of all but just a handful, and by a handful I mean 2 or 3 providers. So there's new systems out there in the commercial sector, leveraging. I think the CubeSat is called. I think the company's called Pumpkin. That there's technology out there like putting up. This is happening. Like a ring of satellites in geostationary orbit that act as like a dot matrix scanner of the Earth. So every day they just sit up there in a ring, or actually not even a ring, and just like an arc, because obviously the Earth, for those of you who don't know, the Earth like spins, anyway. So it spins around, and these satellites just sit up there and just go click, 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 scanning the Earth with a bunch of little, box sats. There's other technology around that was pioneered, quite frankly, by SpaceX, and again, like Palantir. By the way, I have some idea. I'm not going to bore you with it now. I have some ideas on how to onshore commercial tech that gets, that's deeper than this conversation will allow. But SpaceX should have been a good example, but it's not, because it took a billionaire down to his last shot, and then he was no longer a billion, or I'll use a pop culture reference. There was no more Tres Comas. It was he was down to 0 comas. Of his Falcon 9 rocket, and he was broke. So yeah, it succeeded, but whether it did or it didn't, okay, give me another 10 or even 5, billionaires who are gonna blow their entire fortune trying to succeed in that market. I mean, it's just, so my concern with that is the people that are succeeding despite themselves, and it's just not scalable. So at the end of the day, my solution is getting around the contractual and bureaucratic barriers that these guys have been hitting on as well.
Well, one example I would point to in modern practice, you were pointing to the internet, what's the converse? I would say that you should, a great example would be the adoption of cloud services into the federal government, and especially the system FedRAMP, if you get a chance. This is, I think, similarly a reason for us to be optimistic about the way that the federal government is thinking about buying technology. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, FedRAMP federal government knows that it needs to move away from big static data centers, which are prohibitively expensive and not particularly flexible or scalable, and move into a cloud platform like most of the Fortune 500 companies did, over the past 10 years. So a bunch of agencies said, well, we don't know anything about cloud. How are we going to do this? So they set out a bunch of standards. They said FedRAMP is going to reflect our standards for what any cloud provider to the federal government is required to have. And a couple of the biggies got their platforms certified FedRAMP. Amazon Web Services probably being the best example and the most dominant player today. And like so many of these other things, you can pick at their performance, or there have been some stumbles. But bottom line, we took a commercial capability, imported it into the federal space very successfully enough that the CIA has largely moved its data storage, big data processing power onto Amazon Web Services. So I think that's a really, really positive example to your point. I would also say that, to my previous point around the federal government, in a lot of ways, just looks like any other big corporation. We can get wrapped around the axle around the mission that we're not making revenue, that we're not billing or selling a product. But at the end of the day, it has a massive payroll department, massive HR benefits department, massive medical, all of these things that just any other company has to deal with. And so all of those things should be ripe opportunities to pull a Zenefits type solution into the federal space.
I think that is a really cool question that you asked. No one's ever really asked it to me, which I think is a really interesting question. I'm still germinating on it. Because it's funny, I think about it, I'm like, when I talk to my companies, I tell them to use the reverse language than they use in the Valley. I say, shut up about disruption, shut up about innovation, shut up about what you're going to do 3 years from now. Tell me what is reliable, consistent, and already ready to go. And don't mention any of the risk or any of the future stuff when you're selling to the public sector, because they don't want that, right? It's not their language, right? So it's an interesting question, and I think we tend to focus on defense a lot. And I don't know if that's necessarily how I would answer the question. I mean, I think it's very possible, but I also think that that technology will increasingly, I think the government will become more personalized and decentralized because of technology, and I also think it'll become increasingly displaced and replaced by technology. So I actually think it will have a massive impact, but I think of it more in the broader sense of, if you think about education, you think about health, you think about the more kind of consumer-facing things rather than the behind-the-scenes tech infrastructure things. I think that's where more of the disruption will be. I mean, even think about when we start voting on our iPhones, which no one sees coming, but it will eventually, right? Maybe not in the next 10 years, maybe not in the next 20, but it's coming, right? And that will significantly change government. So I do think tech will disrupt it. I'm just not sure if it's in the traditional way that we invest, although I hope it is. It's a good question. I still have to germinate on it, but that would be my initial reaction.
All right, maybe one last question. If not, it's a warm room. It's a gorgeous afternoon. Please join me in thanking the panelists and Raj again.